A live television broadcast. The operating room, brighter than any stage, was set for one of the most difficult surgeries in the world. The air was thick with suspense. Then he appeared. The renowned surgeon stepped forward, face carved in stone, his voice like steel. "I once believed in God, but not anymore. Now I believe only in machines, in science. Faith doesn't save lives." The audience froze. His words landed like a hammer blow against the hearts of millions watching. Why would a man of medicine dare to say such a thing? Did he not fear divine punishment? His life, as it turned out, had already exacted a terrible price. But what happens when a human being dares to stand toe-to-toe with God himself? When science and faith collide like two unstoppable trains on the same track, which one survives the impact? The screen faded to black, only to reopen on a story of tragedy and perhaps a miracle. The man who dared to challenge God, the surgical lights blazed down like a miniature sun inside a sealed world. Amid the clatter of steel and the flicker of monitors, one figure emerged, the celebrated surgeon the press hailed as the golden hands of medicine. He had saved thousands of lives, rewritten the destiny of countless families. Many believed he was born to perform miracles. At a press conference packed shoulder to shoulder, a young reporter rose, eyes burning with conviction. "Doctor, is it true that the hand of God guides you? That only through him could you save so many lives?" The question struck like a dismissal of everything he had worked for, reducing a lifetime of discipline and sacrifice to the invisible strings of a higher power. The doctor's face darkened. His eyes sharpened like glass under pressure. His lips pressed tight before he answered, his voice ringing out like a scalpel cutting through silence. "Science is everything. And God? Nothing but an illusion." The room froze. Some sat in shock, others fumed with anger, while a few began whispering desperate prayers right where they stood. His words cut like a surgeon's blade into centuries of faith, exposing the raw flame of defiance burning inside him. By morning, the headline had spread to every corner, "The Man Who Denies God." And a haunting question began to echo in the public's mind. How could a man who saved so many lives lose his own faith? The origin of tragedy 10 years earlier, long before the spotlight and the standing ovations, the doctor had a home filled with laughter. A gentle wife, her eyes alight with hope, carried the child they had both longed for, their firstborn, the miracle he believed would crown his life. Then came the thunderbolt. A routine checkup, a set of scans, and the verdict struck cold: terminal cancer. The disease didn't just knock on their door. It barged in and shattered the walls of their happiness. That day, the consultation room turned into a chamber of despair. In front of him lay two paths, a cruel decision: save his wife or save the child she carried. Her hand clasped his, trembling but firm. Through searing pain, she forced a fragile smile. "Let our child live. That will be the most beautiful gift I could ever give you." He clenched his jaw, his heart split like glass under a hammer. In the end, he chose the child. His wife breathed her last on the operating table, leaving in his eyes a wound that would never close. From that day forward, he locked his heart in mourning. He buried himself in medicine like a man possessed, clinging only to scalpels, machines, and formulas. Love and faith, the very light of his life, were extinguished with her final breath. He went on living, but what remained was a man made of flesh and steel, with no room left for God and no space for faith. "10 years later, a decade slipped by quiet as a breeze, yet sharp enough to erode even the hardest stone. The child once saved at the cost of a life was now a 10-year-old girl, bright, quick, with wide, searching eyes that mirrored her late mother's. But fate's cruelty lingered. Within her veins pulsed the same disease that had claimed her mother's life. Her room looked less like a home than a miniature laboratory. White walls, harsh fluorescent light, the sting of antiseptic thick in the air. At her bedside, X-rays, test results, and blood reports piled high, like invisible indictments waiting to be read. Her father, now a renowned physician, was both healer and jailer. He monitored every breath, every meal, every pill she swallowed. To him, she was not a child in need of love, but patient zero, the most important case of his career, watched day and night. Each morning, instead of hearing the warmth of "Good morning, sweetheart," she awoke to the scratch of a pen on paper, the beep of a heart monitor, and his flat command, "Take your medicine." While other children raced across playgrounds, hair streaming in the wind, her world was bounded by hospital beds and 4 drips. Her laughter, when it came, was quickly drowned out by the cold hum of machines. She longed for her father's embrace, a gentle word, a hand stroking her hair. But since the day her mother died, his heart had turned to stone. He no longer looked at her with the eyes of a father, but with the clinical gaze of a doctor dissecting symptoms. And so, on certain nights, when the moonlight slipped quietly through the hospital window, she would turn her face into the pillow and whisper, "Daddy, I don't just want to live. I want to be loved." But the room, stripped of warmth, answered only with the steady hiss of a ventilator, its mechanical lullaby soothing not childhood dreams, but the aching hunger for affection inside a little girl's heart. The optimistic boy appears one April morning. Sunlight streamed through the hospital's glass panes, golden and thick, like honey poured into a place too long starved of warmth. Down the sterile hallway came a new breath of life, a 10-year-old boy, thin and fragile, his hair sparse from chemotherapy, yet his smile shone as bright as the rising sun. Unlike the heavy air that usually smothered the wards, he was a spark of fire driving back the shadows. Each step he took, though weak, rang like the playful notes of a children's song. Nurses paused, startled, when they heard him whisper, "I'm not afraid, because God is healing me." The words, innocent and unshaken, unsettled many. For in a place where everything was measured in lab values, charts, and heart rate graphs, this boy carried an invisible medicine, faith. When he was placed in the same room as the doctor's daughter, something quietly miraculous began to bloom. For the first time in years, she had a peer to talk to laugh with. The monotonous beeping of machines was now joined by bursts of laughter, hushed storytelling, and the fragile but boundless dreams painted by 2 young imaginations. The boy spoke of his visions, wide meadows brimming with flowers, breezes that carried songs, and God smiling at him from afar. She listened, eyes wide, as though seeing a window crack open onto another world, far beyond the cold white walls. "You really are a miracle," she whispered, cheeks flushing with wonder. From that day forward, she called him her magic friend. In a world her father had turned into a sterile laboratory, the boy gave her a slice of sky. Like a tender sprout forcing its way through stone, he planted within her something no machine, no medicine could ever give: hope. Two worlds collide in the days that followed. The hospital room, once ruled by the cold hum of machines, began to echo with unfamiliar sounds. The soft murmur of children's prayers, small hands folded beneath the pale glow of a bedside lamp. The doctor's daughter, who for years had known only her father's voice reciting lab results, now whispered the words her roommate had taught her: "Dear Lord, please heal me." Her father walked in at that exact moment. What met his eyes was not a patient under strict observation, but his frail daughter, eyes closed, lips trembling as she prayed. For a fleeting second, his heart tightened, then instantly froze into ice. His voice cut the silence like a scalpel. "Don't waste yourself on foolish fantasies. Only medicine, only machines, only my hands are keeping you alive." Prayer has never saved anyone. The room fell deathly still, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor, like a clock counting down. The girl opened her eyes, gazing at him with a clarity both tender and unyielding. Her voice was soft, yet it rang out like a bell against the wall he had built around his heart for 10 years. "Daddy, I need you to believe in me, not just in the machines." The words drifted through the air, light as a petal, yet powerful enough to crack the steel encasing his chest. For the first time, he saw her not as patient number one to be managed, but as a soul longing for love, faith, and her father's companionship. In that room, two worlds clashed violently, one of cold science, precise numbers, and unyielding logic, the other of faith, hope, and innocent prayers. And standing at the crossroads was a little girl, fragile as a leaf, yet brave enough to face the storm that was her godless father. A small miracle the hospital carried on with its familiar symphony, the steady tap of nurses' shoes down the hallway, the mechanical rhythm of heart monitors, the squeak of metal carts across cold tile floors. But inside the children's room, another sound had begun to weave its way through the sterile air: laughter. At first, the father frowned whenever he heard his daughter giggling with her new friend. To him, it was nothing more than childish distraction, an unnecessary detour in her treatment. Yet soon the charts in his hands rang like a shocking bell. Her health was improving. The monitor's rhythm grew steady, her pain attacks softened, her lab results brightened where once they had weighed him down. It was a paradox. Science offered no answer for why the presence of a frail boy, himself battling cancer, could soothe the illness tormenting his daughter. The doctor, a man who believed every phenomenon must bow to biology, suddenly found himself lost in a maze without exit. He watched as the two children folded paper shapes, hummed nursery songs, whispered secrets between giggles. And each time his daughter laughed, a flicker of unease crossed his face, like a betrayal by the cold numbers he had worshipped all his life. Still, his pride raised its fortress walls. He told himself, this has nothing to do with prayer or faith. It's coincidence, nothing more. But deep within, a small crack had formed in that wall of reason. It did not collapse with thunder, but it splintered quietly, just enough to make him linger in the doorway, watching his daughter each time she clasped her friend's hand and smiled. That room had become a garden inside the gray hospital. Two children, one with faith burning bright, the other with eyes thirsty for love, were planting seeds of hope. And no matter how fiercely the doctor denied it, those seeds had already begun to sprout, breaking loose the first bricks in the fortress of his doubt. The confrontation that evening, the last rays of sunlight spilled through the hospital window, laying golden threads across the tiled floor, warm yet fragile, like strands that could snap at any moment. The father stood there, arms crossed, his gaze sharp as steel, watching his daughter chatter happily with the frail boy. Inside him, confusion gnawed. Why does her health seem to bloom every time that boy is near? The boy lifted his head and met the man's stern eyes. But instead of shrinking back, he stepped forward. His eyes shone, clear and steady, like a still lake mirroring the sky. His voice didn't falter. It rang out with quiet conviction. You heal with machines, sir. But I heal with hope. She needs both. The words landed in the room like a stone cast into a still pond, sending ripples deep into the father's guarded heart. It wasn't childish play, but an arrow shot straight into the fortress of pride he had built over decades. In that instant, the man felt as if someone had struck him, not with a fist, but with a truth so simple it hurt. Medicine can patch up the body, but the soul requires something far greater. The breaking point then came the day of reckoning, like a sudden storm crashing down without warning. In the middle of a critical procedure, the numbers on the monitor plunged. The once steady heartbeat spiked, then dropped, like a rudderless ship tossed into a raging sea. The alarm shrieked through the room, piercing and merciless, like the cry of death itself pounding on the door. Nurses rushed in, metal instruments clattering against trays, sharp and cold as steel on stone. The father stood at the center of the operating room, sweat pouring from him like rain, his hands, once steady as rock, now trembling. He had saved countless lives before, but this was no ordinary patient lying before him. This was his daughter. He compressed her chest, pushed the syringe, barked frantic orders at his team. Yet every move felt powerless against an unseen force wrestling with her fragile breath. And in that pit of desperation, a thought crept in like darkness seeping through a cracked door. Maybe. I've lost. And then, what had never happened in 10 long years finally came. The doctor, the man who once proclaimed God nothing but an illusion, broke down sobbing in the middle of the operating room. Hot tears seeped into his mask, blurring his vision, as if an earthquake had shattered the frozen wasteland of his heart. 10 years of hardness, 10 years of pride, 10 years of denial. All collapsed in the instant he saw his daughter teetering between life and death. The first prayer in the blinding white of the operating room, the surgical lights blazed down like a desert sun, yet his heart was frozen in ice. Machines pulsed in frantic rhythm, each alarm pounding like a war drum. Nurses moved in urgency, syringes and paddles flying in sequence, but the lifeline on the monitor flickered like a candle in a violent storm. The father, the doctor, went still. His hands trembled, no longer the steady instruments that once carved life from the edge of death. He no longer saw a case, a statistic, a patient. On that table lay his 10-year-old daughter, the blood of his blood, the soul of his soul, the last living fragment of the woman he had loved. For the first time in 10 years, he let go of formulas, of cold calculations and reason. He bent down, clutching that small hand, frail, fragile, yet warm, as if it were the last patch of sky left in his world. His voice cracked, each word cutting him open as it left his lips. "I believe you will live. You are my miracle." The entire team froze. It wasn't the commanding voice of a renowned surgeon. It wasn't the defiant tone of a man who had mocked faith for a decade. It was the trembling cry of a father, weak, vulnerable, but overflowing with love. And in that suspended moment, the room seemed to hush. The machines softened, the beeping grew slower, steadier, like a heart answering his whisper. For the first time since he had turned his back on God, a prayer escaped his soul. Not in words, but in aching silence. "If you are real, let her stay. Give me the chance to be her father, not just her doctor." There, amid the sting of antiseptic, beneath the searing light and the wail of death's alarms, a seed of faith pushed through the barren soil of his heart. The miracle in that instant, while the father still knelt at the operating table, clutching his daughter's hand, an unexpected sound pierced the tension. Beep, beep, beep. The heart monitor studied. At first, it was faint, like the shallow breaths of a drowning man dragged back from the depths. Then stronger, fuller, until it throbbed like a drum announcing the dawn. Doctors and nurses froze, eyes wide, hardly daring to believe. Minutes earlier, the child's life had dangled by a thread so thin it seemed ready to snap. Now it flared back like a flame revived by a sudden gust of wind. The father lifted his head, tears blurring his vision. And in that trembling moment, he saw her tiny fingers move, just the slightest twitch, but enough to feel like an answer. As if she was whispering, "Daddy, I'm not giving up." News spread beyond the sterile walls of the operating room like a rushing wind. Down the pediatric ward, where children waged quiet wars against cancer, something extraordinary unfolded. Frail hands, pale from chemotherapy, folded together like budding lilies. Leading them was the boy, the miracle friend, his eyes glowing, his smile radiant, as though he had always known this resurrection was coming. In a voice barely louder than a breath, he whispered, "God is healing her." A ripple of prayer followed, not loud like a choir's hymn, but fragile and luminous, like dozens of candles lit at once in the dark. The murmurs of children's voices wove themselves into the rhythm of the machines, composing a strange symphony where medicine and faith no longer collided, but touched, embraced, became one. The father stood in stunned silence. He had never believed in God, never trusted in prayer. Yet here, surrounded by the sight and sound of hope, he felt a presence no scalpel could cut open, no chart could measure. It was not in formulas or statistics, but in the living bond between hearts. And he understood, miracles do not always come from scalpels or medicine. Sometimes they are born in the quiet power of love and faith shared by the smallest of souls. The price and the gift after the storm. It seemed as if the sky above the hospital had cleared. His daughter had slipped past the scythe of death, her breathing steady, her skin slowly regaining its blush, like a tender shoot pushing through after a brutal winter. The father clung to that hope, his heart lighter than it had been in years. But just as dawn seemed secure, another shadow fell. Across the hall, at the bed where laughter and childlike prayers once rang out, the miracle boy began to falter. His small body, after so many battles, could no longer keep fighting. He slipped away on a gentle morning as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the hospital window. A faint smile lingered on his lips, serene, almost triumphant. Before his eyes closed for the last time, he left behind a gift for the doctor's daughter, a rough sketch, clumsy in form but boundless in spirit, a blue sky, birds in flight, and a trembling line of words, as if written with the weight of his soul. Every breath is already a miracle. The girl clutched the drawing to her chest, tears running down her cheeks. Yet in her gaze, sorrow was not the only flame. Something new had been lit, a fire of faith, passed on from her small friend who had departed, but left behind an invisible legacy. The father stood by in silence. His heart ached as if this loss belonged to him too. But for the first time, he did not see it as meaningless. A truth long denied finally broke through. Medicine may heal the body, but it is faith that saves the soul. And in that moment, he bowed his head before what he had resisted for years. There are mysteries no scalpel can reach, no medicine can hold. Some miracles are born only from love and hope. A hopeful ending time passed, like a river that carries away the noise of storms, leaving only the quiet traces that endure. The doctor who once stood defiant, proud enough to challenge God himself, was no longer the same man. The cold stare and sharp lips that once dismissed faith had softened. In their place stood a figure humbled, steady, walking slower now, but with steps firm and sure. He founded a charity and, together with his colleagues, built a new hospital. Over its gate, the name gleamed, the Light Hospital, dedicated to the boy who taught him to believe. People came not only to be treated with medicine, scalpels, and machines, but also to be healed by love, hope, and compassion. In every ward, beyond the steady beeps of heart monitors, bright drawings covered the walls, pictures painted by children, skies washed in blue, birds in flight, and shaky but radiant words that seemed to glow with innocence and faith. Every breath is a miracle. The doctor continued his work, but he was changed. Each time he held a scalpel, he no longer saw only a body in need of repair. He saw a soul in need of being held, of being carried with hope. He was no longer just a physician. He had become a sower of faith. The final scene, a golden sunset spills honey light across the hospital corridors. The father, the doctor, walks hand in hand with his daughter, now healthy and strong. Together they pause before the boy's old drawing, the one left behind as both gift and legacy. They look up, eyes glistening, their hands tightening around each other's as if holding both past and future in a single grasp. And then, the narrator's voice rises, deep and tender, like a closing benediction. He had lost a part of his life, but in return he found faith. And that was the greatest miracle of all.